Hi, it's Jess, and you're watching to or listening to the Flaky Foodie Podcast, the only show where the discussion is delicious and there's chatter to chew on. On today's episode, we have with us the incredible Miss Greta Hardin. She knows a lot about food and food history, and she has a wonderful podcast that I listen to from time to time, The History of American Food, and I absolutely love it. And today we're going to talk about the history of spice in America. And I am very excited to learn and to listen. So welcome, Greta, to the show. It's phenomenal to have you here today.
I'm really excited to talk to you. I mean, I found your podcast and immediately wanted to invite you into things I was doing. So I'm glad to come visit you.
Yes, just excitement all around today. So tell me a little bit about how you got into food history and science, because I tell you, I love the little nuggets that she drops on her, or that you drop on your Twitter page about food and food history, and the way you look at it is amazing. So kind of how did you get here?
I mean, all my life, I knew I was going to be a scientist. I was going to grow up and I was going to be a scientist, but I was very, very fascinated by history as well and the stories that were there, and how sometimes reading about history was either like entering another world. So it clicked in with sort of all of like the sci-fi and the fantasy I enjoyed. And then also there was all these hints of like something's missing, something's not there. And so it was just, just to dig deeper and lift up things and look at it. But somewhere along the way, I realized that science, especially chemistry, which is what I was teaching most of the time, is actually just this really weird specialized culinary education.
Food and science, especially baking and science, go hand in hand.
So all three of those things, I just sort of combined them together. And my pandemic baby was this food history podcast, because like everybody else, I was listening to a lot and I was like, there's this one that I really wish I could hear. So like, I'll just make it.
So for those who may go check out your podcast after, it's kind of divided into different time periods. Do you care to kind of talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, I sort of looked at like how one thing that happened to me while I was quarantined was I was cooking food from literally all over the globe. I'm like, how can I, from my own little house, just like be picking and choosing food from here, there, and everywhere by just, driving up to this street, to this like one section of Seattle that has food from around the globe. How did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
So I just started diving in, and I'm like, okay, so we basically started on a diet of ship stores, which is nasty.
Hardtack.
And sort of figured out, well, like, how did we get from there to say like Korean barbecue tacos? How did that happen?
That's a big leap there. From no vegetables and maybe getting scurvy on a ship to all these fresh fruits and vegetables and things.
Yeah. And so just tracing that history and figuring out how it all happened, it was like this great adventure I could go on. And make friends with my librarians along the way. Definitely a library stan over here, because this would not be possible without it.
Yes. So you're going to kind of serve as our conductor on this train ride as we kind of travel through the history of spice in America. So what's kind of our first stop, our first station? How did spice get here?
So the first spice definitely came over with the first, 10 boats to drop colonists off in the colonies. Whether it was Jamestown or in Plymouth or some of the other non-British based colonies, everybody, even if they didn't have spice, they really, really enjoyed it. Cloves and nutmeg and mace, they were all a huge deal back in England, and, just were an important part of how people, if not prepared food on a daily basis, how they prepared and made note of celebration food. It was a show of power. It was a show of wealth. And if you just don't have that many objects in your diet, having something that tastes really amazing like spice was an important part.
You mentioned that it was used as currency as well. How did that work?
Oh, so at the time, in those first, colonial 50 years, there just wasn't a lot of coin over here. There wasn't paper money at all. But there just weren't a lot of coins. And so you had to come up with things that held their value. And everybody knew kind of how much a nutmeg was. Everybody wanted some cloves. Everybody wanted some cinnamon. Everybody wanted some raisins. And these were sort of like known quantities of a somewhat known value. So you could trade so many nutmegs for a cow, or, so many raisins to help people put up your house.
So these spices, where they weren't able to grow them in America, so it was all kind of reliant on the ships kind of bringing it in, shipment of spices, I'm assuming.
Oh, absolutely. In
Yes.
fact, the thing that knocked my socks off was realizing that so much that we take for granted in how global trade works is so rooted in the sort of discovery of the spice trade, when the Dutch and the French and the British all found the sort of the sources of spices. Cloves and nutmeg actually are from two tiny little islands in the Indian Ocean, which is astounding. And so there was a lot of blood and treasure spilled, either trying to keep the monopoly of that, or to try to break the monopoly and, grow cloves elsewhere, grow nutmeg elsewhere, and sort of expand this. I mean, these things were so valuable. It was sort of the one way you could literally grow money on trees.
Yes. So I'm still picturing of somebody selling a cow for 6 nutmegs or however much it is. That is fascinating. So, how did kind of Native Americans and the kind of interaction between the people who settled, colonists who settled in America, and Native Americans, did Native Americans bring different spices? Did the colonists kind of introduce Native Americans to different spices that they didn't have? How did that work?
That's a really interesting question. As far as foodstuffs, most of the colonists looked upon the bounty that was America, and like basically, if it wasn't an animal, they pretty much kind of didn't bother with it. They really weren't that interested in a lot of American plant foods to begin with. They imported a whole bunch of their own plant foods, corn being a really notable exception.
Because corn is awesome!
Because it was sort of like, okay, fine, I'll eat corn or I'll die. But other than that, they're just an utter lack of curiosity, unless it was something that they kind of recognized. And so the Native Americans definitely had their own spices. The one exception is sassafras. Somewhere along there, some of the earliest explorers noticed that sassafras was being used as a tea, as a poultice, as a lot of different things in different customs. And somehow they decided sassafras was the wonder drug. It was sort of like kale and kombucha and I don't know, something else all rolled into one.
So if they had their own little t-shirt presses, you would get the Eat Sassafras shirts.
There is this enormous 16th century drug trade between England and the Virginia colony in sassafras, and it was supposed to help with fertility, cure syphilis. I don't know, give you a better singing voice. I don't know. You name it, it could do it.
Yes. And so we know sassafras most commonly in root beer. So how did that come to be? Do you know?
So that was sort of like one of its leftover things. I mean, even today, people will still have sassafras tea, and you can, if you chew on the sticks, it kind of has a numbing thing. So it was good for people with toothaches. But its widest use for a long time is as a thickener in gumbo. The gumbo filet is sassafras powder. And so that sort of became its biggest use, along with sassafras tea. And that was the way people sort of defended against scurvy, because there's a bunch of vitamin C, and it's, just sort of a general spring tonic. But as all these other uses for sassafras and sarsaparilla were were sort of faded out, some of these old nostalgic things were left in just to remember.
Okay, so it was kind of after the big sassafras craze.
Yeah.
Just the leftover flavor. Okay.
Right.
So after the colonists came over and had their clove, their nutmeg, what was kind of the next kind of step in the evolution of spice in America?
So for a long time, they were really sort of stuck in this clove, nutmeg, bay leaves, onions, and then some herbs like thyme, parsley, those sort of got stuck for a long time. However, you get sort of to the end of the 18th century and Southern cuisine is starting to spread more into the rest of the country. And the chili pepper and the tomato finally sort of like make their move. So the English colonists themselves weren't particularly adventurous, and they were like, okay with onion, super garlic suspicious. And we're happy when black pepper showed up, but black pepper was expensive. And the heat of it could be replicated by dried ground chili peppers. And so you find dried red pepper or long pepper sometimes in some cookbooks when they finally started trading those chili peppers up and down the coast. So that was sort of the next thing that invaded or moved around.
Okay. So it was the big chili pepper craze. Around what time period is this?
It really sort of gets going in the late 18th century. So right around the Revolutionary War, when you have a lot of enslaved people working in plantation kitchens and sort of bringing their knowledge of plant foods into those kitchens, and then people coming down and visiting as, they're figuring out, okay, how are we going to put together this government? How are we going to do trade within our new country? And they're like, wow, not only are you eating vegetables, they're awfully tasty. How are you doing this? And so ground red pepper started to sort of move slowly up, but it was really used kind of the same way we use like black salt and pepper, like black pepper today. It wasn't so much like we think of like chili having like sweetness and heat and these varieties of flavors. It was just sort of this like low level heat that would sort of be added and scattered in. Michael Twitty, when he talks about kitchen pepper, it's sort of this combination of like maybe some cumin, maybe some fennel, maybe some chili pepper, maybe some salt, maybe this, every kitchen kind of had their own blend. And so once
like a seasoning salt.
Yeah, exactly like that. And so people started growing their own gardens, and they were able to really sort of establish the herbs from home. What was going on here in America, all the herbs and spices available here, the colonists just were not curious. So, I mean, ramps maybe because they were just basically onions, but what spices were available in the US sort of as native species was not of interest to the earlier colonists.
That's really interesting. I always thought it was kind of a borrow here, borrow there, but it was just kind of reserved for, as you said, meat and maybe corn. Was it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, cranberries became a big thing, but they were sort of recognizable as berries. And then they are also, they became a cash crop. But just sort of like hunting around and doing that exploratory work of like, is this tasty? Does this add anything? That was not done because this was a savage land with savage things. And they wouldn't sort of make more elevated, elegant, civilized cuisine.
That's really interesting. So you have the chili pepper kind of coming in. What was kind of the next big explosion of spice?
So the next big change that happened, and it was, oh my goodness, the people who ran society hated this one. It was garlic.
Oh, now you're speaking my language. Things just got interesting. Okay. So tell me about the garlic.
So garlic sort of came in from a bunch of directions, and it had to make a bunch of running starts at getting into American food. I mean, garlic was a huge player in South and Central America. The Caribbean was all about garlic. They were happy about it there. Garlic was great because it stored even better than onions, because, onions will eventually go bad, but garlic you can dry and it'll just behave itself. But when you had Italians and Eastern Europeans and people from South and Central Asia, when you had the Chinese coming in to build the railroads, I mean, we were basically being bombarded by garlic from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from the South. And everybody finally gave up, and they're like, this is pretty good, but let's not go crazy. So when you look at the cookbooks from the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, they'll be like, 1 teaspoon of garlic, serve 6.
Oh, wow. Yes. They were definitely holding back on the garlic.
And so it was like, this is tasty, but, I mean, I was astounded. Somebody reminded me that in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, which came out, in the middle of the 20th century, Jimmy Stewart's wife sort of says something disparaging about, oh, I bet you're going to go talk to the garlic eaters.
Oh, wow.
He likes to sit by and watch his friends go places because he's trapped. Yes, sir, trapped into frittering his life away, playing nursemaid to a lot of garlic eaters.
Oh, wow.
Like, it was still seen as this, dirty, stinky foreigner food.
Oh, wow. Huh.
But especially when the Chinese came in to build the railroads and dig for gold in California and from the West Coast, they brought ginger, they brought garlic, they brought, a lot of sort of bitter greens that we really appreciate today. But we thought they were weird and funny tasting back then.
So you have garlic. You mentioned all of these different nationalities, ethnicities coming in from each side, and they brought garlic. Did they bring anything else, or did it take a little while for it to catch on? Was garlic just like okay, that's enough, we'll just take the garlic?
I really think it was sort of like, oh, whoa, we'll just take the garlic. Somewhere kind of between the turn of the 20th century and up to World War II, we started to experiment in spice mixes. And if you sort of think about the magic of the spice mix, so Kentucky Fried Chicken and the 11 herbs and spices. And like one of the secret ingredients in there is white pepper. The French love to use white pepper. The Chinese use a lot of white pepper, but Americans, unless we're like cooking something special out of a Julia Child thing, we're like, what? And so for really most of the 20th century, we sort of topped out on, what individual spices we would have in our kitchens, but we did get fascinated with spice mixes. And sort of, so you have something called beau monde, which was sort of a Creole seasoning. You have the Cajun spice mixes. You start to get, hot sauces a little bit, especially in the second half of the 20th century, when Cajun food and salsa start to explode and it gets really exciting. And it's really not until, I would say, the 1980s or the 1990s when Americans discover they love garlic, finally. And as a consequence of our meddling around in Southeast Asia, we start to get a whole new appreciation for new herbs and spices and for fresh herbs. Because for a long time, people were buying, I kid you not, dried parsley and dried chives.
Which we all know turns to cardboard, kind of loses a lot of flavor when you dry it.
It was like, there's nothing there. I mean, a lot of things dried are fine. I mean, dried ginger, dried onion,
Thyme is the same, yeah.
Exactly. Dill is great, but dried parsley, man. What are we? But the spice mix, and then, sort of enter cilantro, enter lemongrass, and then a whole new set of chili peppers coming at us from Southeast Asia, really opened our eyes. And then we realized, wait, there's not just paprika, there's smoked paprika, there's hot paprika, there's sweet, we started just getting very excited by all of these varieties. So the end of the 20th century was when people started to realize that there was freshness and that there was variety. And I think from there, we've gone a little crazy.
Yes, my spice cabinet is full of everything from everywhere, from garam masala to Cajun blackened seasoning mix, all the way to 5 spice. So, that's all in one cabinet. And that just shows how global our pantries have become.
And the interesting thing is, you look at your Cajun spice and you look at your curry mixture and you look at garam masala, and you realize there's some spices that are in all of them. Like black pepper is almost in all of them, or chili peppers will be in most of them. Or you realize, like, wow, star anise is in this one and that one and that one. And it becomes very interesting how it's really just kind of a smaller handful has been combined and recombined and combined again into these different combinations. And, there's like infinity possibilities.
Do you have any other kind of spice related little history nuggets, just like you had about the nutmeg coming from 2 tiny islands?
Well, another fun one is, so the island of Grenada was established as sort of the Caribbean home of nutmeg. In fact, their flag, when they declared independence, actually has this very interesting stylized nutmeg motif on it. It's fun to look up. But cloves have a very close relative, allspice.
A lot of Jamaican people use allspice in the Caribbean.
And so I find it fascinating that there's cloves all the way over in the Indian Ocean, and practically on the literal other side of the world, you have its other spicy relative, allspice. Again, all the way over there in the Caribbean. Like, what? How? How did that happen? So whenever people are kind of like, oh, it was aliens who built the pyramid, or aliens who built this other thing with rocks stacked up on top, I'm like, no, everybody can figure out how to lift a heavy rock. It's something that it's something that happens when you have enough time. But if aliens were going to meddle, I'd say putting these few spices in these few tiny places, because, spices caused the world to meet itself, to turn in on itself, and to create the global trading network that we have now, which is amazing, for good or for ill. Here we are, and you can kind of blame it on spice.
So can we talk a little bit about how the spice trade kind of opened up global trade as we know it and kind of expanded communications? How does that happen? Share everything.
So I sort of, like, we've all heard of the Spice Islands. I mean, it's the brand name, but sort of realizing that the earliest records of sort of a global style spice trade actually happened with China, the east coast of Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. And it was sort of the Islamic Empire that's really started the overland spice trade, because, they, moved all over. They moved into India with the Mughal Empire. They moved all the way across North Africa. And so it was just sort of these long tentacles of spice. And so that's how, Europe was like, hey, what is this? This is cool. And that was partly what drove the Portuguese to start to figure out, well, how about if we don't have to walk the whole way? What if we could do it by boat?
Mm-hmm.
The only problem was there is this huge Africa in the way. And so it took them, I don't know, approximately 100 years from the time they started thinking about it to Vasco da Gama finally getting all the way around.
Mm-hmm.
And, as dark and stinky and sour beer and uncomfortable as that was, it was still shorter and less expensive a way to move spice than it was over land by camel and donkey and human and heaven knows what. And that really flipped over the spice trade. You could bring back tons and tons of spice in these boats. And it just changed the world. And so once the Portuguese were doing it, then the Dutch were doing it, and the Spanish were doing it, and the French were doing it, and the English were doing it. And of course, they couldn't just all be happy for each other. They had to fight about it.
Yeah. Everything was war.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
But I do think it's interesting. That was one of the first times a lot of Europeans, after the Middle Ages shut down, people stopped traveling to the Holy Land and doing crusades, and just a lot of mobility ended for lots of reasons. Mm-hmm. But these people were going to these far and distant lands and realizing there were people that looked different, spoke different languages, had different religions. I mean, their clothes were way nicer, but for a lot of people, it was this eye-opening idea, like, wow, the world is a lot bigger than like my house, my valley, and this king. And so a lot of adventurism really started up. And the age of exploration. I mean, tea has a lot to answer for. Suddenly people were drinking caffeine instead of alcohol for breakfast. And I swear that changed things.
I never thought about that before, but yeah, you read about people drinking mead for breakfast, and now we've moved to tea, which is caffeinated. Never thought about that.
Yeah. Or people would drink, they would drink, tea and smoke tobacco to wind down in the evening. And so, they'd get inspired and they'd write things down, or they'd have a discussion with someone. And if you sit around and
caffeine and nicotine.
Oh, absolutely. But think about it. If you have a conversation with a friend over, let's say, 4 cups of tea versus a conversation with a friend over 4 mugs of beer, which conversation are you going to remember better?
Is that how philosophy gets? No, I'm just kidding.
No, you're not off.
So that just shows food is powerful, changes the discussion, changes the world in the spice trade. That's fascinating.
But yeah, the connections that spice has made, the trails that it's left for good or for ill, the way it's made the world both bigger and smaller. I think it's changed how humanity sees the globe and how we can reach each other and touch each other. But as another food journalist has said, it's hard to make it's hard to make too big a fool of yourself if your mouth is full.
I love that. I feel like that should be printed and put on my wall or like over here. I think that's going to be my philosophy as well. So I had a question too about, as England was kind of settling America, you also have the French and the Spanish. Did they kind of interact and exchange spices, or was that just no?
In sort of background ways, this is the thing where cookbooks are definitely history books, just not a lot of people think of them that way. And so you can see, people exchanging recipes, but that would usually be this cook to that cook, this wife to that wife. Or as, one family moved from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti, and brought their enslaved cooks and house staff with them. And they started talking with the other high society cooks in, say, South Carolina or New York. And then recipes would exchange that way. You know, these French cooks with these English cooks. I mean, they're all working below stairs, but you know, they all wanted good job reviews. So they were always coming up with new stuff. And so in public, in male discourse, no, there wouldn't have been a lot of talk, except maybe this tobacco brand and that tobacco brand. But below stairs and in cookbooks, in sort of female spaces, yes, there was a lot of interchange going on.
Okay. That's interesting. So anything else in regards to spice that you would like to share with us today? Anything that you could think of?
So at this point, I just, think we live in a very fortunate time, and to be able to exchange ideas and use spice and flavor as a way to sort of keep the conversation going, to make connections with each other, and to just make our world both bigger and smaller in the most delicious ways is really important.
Yes. Do you have any idea of or predictions about what kind of, based on your study of the past, about what do you think the future of American spice will be? Because now it just seems like wide open. It's like, where do we go from here?
My real hope would be that different regions sort of concentrate, okay, this is what grows here best, and we can sort of develop a culture around it. That would be the coolest. I have like this little hope in my heart that we sort of become regional again as cuisine, because trying to do everything all the time everywhere, I feel like flattens everything out, and the spectacular things either or disappear or fade into the background. Sort of the way gumbo went from something of, wide variety of multiple influences, and now there's just kind of like this one kind of gumbo recipe you can find. But who knows? but that's sort of my own personal wish.
And it is a good one. So thank you so much, Greta, for being on the show today. You guys won't see it. We had some technical difficulties, but when it got going good. So yes, definitely enjoy having you on the show. If people want to check out your show or just kind of follow you and find out more about your kind of history nuggets, where would they go?
So on Twitter, that's where I'm most active. And usually when I'm researching and find strange spellings or, oh my God, I can't believe it stuff, that will be on Twitter at THOA Food. Same handle on Instagram, THOA Food. There, it's more pictures, finished dishes, maybe someday more recipes. We'll see.
I'm rooting for it.
But I love getting questions, just sort of what people are wondering about. Sometimes I'll send you a page from a book to answer your question. Come along for the journey, and I promise you won't get scurvy.
Eat an orange and you'll be all right. Okay, I have been Jess, and this has been the Flaky Foodie Podcast. Treat this episode like gossip or the gospel and tell someone about it. Eat something that's absolutely delicious this week, and you can always tell me about it on any social media platform. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and a tiny little bit on TikTok. So yes, make sure you get in touch with me. And again, thank you so much, Greta, for being here. Have a great week, everybody.